They laughed at her across the dinner table, told 70-year-old Elaine Foster she could sleep in the shed with the tools. Her son Brian smirked. His wife Kelly raised her glass, and the room shook with their cruelty. Elaine didn't argue. She opened her safe that night. Deeds, receipts, and wills stacked in perfect order. By the end of the month, the shed they mocked was emptied, the tools auctioned, and the deed to the house signed away. Brian thought he held power under her roof, but when the papers cleared, he learned the truth. His mother owned the shed, the tools, and the very roof above his head, and she was about to take them all. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The dining room had once been Elaine's pride, mahogany table polished until it gleamed, curtains she'd sewn herself swaying gently with the August breeze. Tonight, it felt like a stage where she'd been cast as the butt of the joke. Brian sat at the head, where his late father used to, shoveling in meatloaf as if it had been his to claim all along. Kelly leaned across her wine glass, her painted nails tapping an idle rhythm against the stem. "So, Mom," Brian said between bites, "when are you going to start downsizing? Can't keep rattling around this place forever. Houses this big need younger hands." Elaine smoothed her napkin, the habit of a lifetime secretary. Control the surface when you can't control the storm. "I managed just fine," Kelly snorted, a sharp, practiced sound. "Manage? Please. Half the time you're forgetting what day it is. Honestly, it's not like you need much space. Plenty of room out back if you're desperate." She tilted her head toward the window, where the shed crouched at the edge of the yard, weathered wood and peeling paint. Hannah froze, fork hovering in midair. "Mom!" Brian cut her off with a laugh, quick and cruel. "Yeah, the shed. You've got your little tools, some shelves. Perfect studio apartment for a 70-year-old, right?" Kelly's laugh joined his, sharp as breaking glass. "Don't forget, dirt floor's good for the joints, builds character." Elaine pressed her lips together until the inside of her cheeks stung. She had lived through decades of cafeteria gossip, secretaries' barbed comments, husbands' silences, and still this landed like a slap she couldn't dodge. She reached for her water glass with a hand steadier than she felt, took a sip, and forced her voice flat. "That's enough." Brian waved her off, eyes already scanning his phone. Kelly smirked, satisfied with the sting left behind. Across the table, Hannah's eyes shone, not with tears, but with fury. The meal finished in silence thick enough to choke. Dishes clinked like accusations as Kelly stacked them deliberately, muttering under her breath about clutter and burden. Elaine excused herself, retreating to the sanctuary of her bedroom before Hannah could speak. Later that night, Ruth arrived with her familiar knock, 3 brisk raps, the same rhythm she'd used since their first carpool shift 40 years ago. Elaine let her in without a word. Ruth studied her friend's face, the tired lines carved deeper than usual. They did it again. Elaine lowered herself onto the couch, the room dim except for the golden glow of a table lamp. She said nothing. Ruth sat across from her, folding her hands. "They don't see what you own. They only see what they want to take." The words cracked something inside Elaine, but no tears came. Instead, a slow ember lit behind her eyes. She leaned forward, her voice quiet but steady. "Then I'll remind them." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "How?" Elaine pushed herself up, knees aching, and crossed the room to the old oak cabinet in the corner. From its bottom drawer, she drew out a small fireproof safe, the weight of decades compressed into metal and locks. With deliberate hands, she spun the dial, each click echoing like a drumbeat. The safe opened with a groan. Inside lay the artifacts of her life, the crisp deed with her name alone across the top, the receipts she'd guarded through lean years, the will written when her husband still lived, folded neatly like a promise. She touched each one as though steadying herself on stepping stones across a river. Behind her, Ruth's eyes narrowed, catching the glimmer in Elaine's expression. "What are you planning?" Elaine turned, her voice just above a whisper. "Something they'll never forget." She closed the safe with a decisive snap. The sound lingered in the air like the closing of a coffin, final and unyielding. And upstairs, footsteps creaked faintly, the careless shuffle of Brian heading to bed, never suspecting the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains, laying soft patterns across Elaine's living room floor. She'd left the safe on the table overnight. its iron weight like a companion she wasn't ready to put away. She settled into her chair with a mug of black coffee, her hands steady, her mind sharpened by the sting of last night's humiliation. One by one, she unfolded the papers inside. The deed came first, her name printed clearly at the top. Elaine Foster, sole owner. Not Brian, not Kelly, Heron. She ran a finger over the ink, the memory rising unbidden. The day she and her late husband had signed it, the pride in his voice when he'd said, "This house will always be yours, no matter what." Next came the mortgage statement, neatly rubber-banded together. Elaine spread them across the table like a dealer laying down cards. She traced the final stamp, paid in full, a date 5 years after her husband's passing. Every check had been hers. Every dime scraped from secretarial paychecks, substitute gigs, and tutoring sessions. She remembered clipping coupons until her hands cramped, working Saturdays when her bones begged her to rest. Brian hadn't offered $1. Kelly hadn't offered a meal. Her throat tightened, but not from sorrow, from resolve. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Hannah slipped inside, her backpack slung low over one shoulder. She didn't sit right away, just hovered by the table, eyes darting to the spread of documents. "Grandma," she whispered, glancing toward the hallway as if her parents might appear. "I need to show you something." From her backpack, she pulled a small digital recorder. She pressed play, and Brian's voice filled the quiet room, louder, crueler than it had felt the night before. "Yeah, the shed. Perfect little retirement suite for the old bat." Kelly's laugh followed, a jagged echo. "Dirt floors are good for the joints. Builds character." Hannah hit pause quickly, her face flushed. "I couldn't just sit there. I had to record it. I thought, maybe you'd need proof." Elaine closed her eyes briefly, the humiliation replaying in sharp detail, but when she opened them again, her gaze was steel. She reached across the table, covering Hannah's trembling hand with her own. "You were right to keep it." At that moment, Ruth stepped in through the back door, a folder tucked under her arm. She looked from the papers to the recorder, her smile slow and knowing. "Evidence and motive," she said, lowering herself into a chair. "A perfect storm, if you ask me." Elaine arched an eyebrow. "And what storm do you think I'm calling down?" Ruth leaned back, tapping the folder against her palm, the kind that sweeps parasites right off the porch. Before Elaine could answer, the phone rang, an old landline that still carried the sharp metallic jangle of another era. She picked it up, her voice crisp. "Mrs. Foster?" The tone on the other end was smooth, measured. Daniel Blake. They hadn't spoken in years, not since he'd handled her husband's modest estate. "I've reviewed the copies you sent. Every asset, house, shed, land, it all sits in your name. There's no ambiguity here." Elaine's breath released slowly, as if she'd been holding it since last night. "No loopholes?" "None they can crawl through," Daniel replied. "If they try to challenge you, I'll dismantle it piece by piece." Her gaze dropped to the document, the neat proof of a lifetime's discipline. For the first time in months, maybe years, her lips curved into something resembling a smile. It wasn't broad or triumphant. It was the faint, sharp smile of someone who knew the battlefield had just shifted in her favor. Across the table, Hannah caught it, her shoulders lifting as if she'd drawn strength directly from her grandmother. Ruth tilted her head, studying Elaine with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "So," she said softly, "what's your first move?" Elaine didn't answer. She simply gathered the papers into a stack, slid them back into the safe, and closed the lid with a slow, deliberate click. The sound echoed through the room like a starter pistol. The shed had always been Brian's territory, or at least that's what he'd told himself. He'd swaggered in and out of it for years, slamming doors, scattering tools, claiming ownership by noise and posture. But on Saturday morning, Elaine stood at the threshold with a notebook in her hand, surveying the place not as a burden, but as an arsenal. Dust motes spun in the slanted light that pierced through gaps in the wood. Rows of gleaming steel and heavy power tools filled the walls and benches. Brian had called it his collection, but Elaine remembered writing the checks, remembered dragging herself down to the hardware store after long shifts. She'd bought most of it after her husband's death. Repairs needed, gutters fixed, siding patched. The receipts lay safe in her files, each one bearing her signature. Hannah stood beside her, Phone ready. Want me to start photographing? Elaine nodded. One by one, clear angles. The girl crouched low, capturing the serial number on a high-end drill, then rose to frame the hulking table saw. Each click of the camera was like a nail being driven in, proof, piece by piece. They spent hours cataloging. Elaine read out descriptions. DeWalt planner, bought in '09, rigid miter saw, '12, while Hannah typed into a spreadsheet she'd pulled up on her laptop. The list grew, a monument of steel and proof. By mid-afternoon, an old pickup rumbled into the driveway. Out stepped a wiry man in a corduroy jacket, clipboard tucked under his arm. "Name's Carson," he introduced himself, shaking Elaine's hand. "Auction house sent me to take a look." He whistled low the moment he stepped inside. "Well, well, this is no backyard stash. You've got serious value here, Mrs. Foster." Elaine watched as he moved with practiced eyes, running his hand across surfaces, jotting figures. Hannah followed, snapping photos as he pointed. "That lathe alone will pull 600. The compressor? Double that. You're sitting on thousands. Easy." "Thousands?" Hannah repeated, eyes wide. Carson grinned. "Closer to 10 if we bundle it right. Men will fight for these at auction. Mark my words." Elaine's lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Good. Let them fight." Carson finished his notes, handed her a card. "Whenever you're ready, call. I'll handle the rest." When he left, Hannah leaned against the workbench, exhaling. "They have no idea, do they?" Elaine closed her notebook. "No." Her voice was low, deliberate. "Not anymore." That evening, the confirmation of their blindness arrived faster than she expected. Hannah, scrolling on her phone, frowned. "Grandma, you need to see this." On Kelly's social media page, a fresh post gleamed, a filtered shot of Brian leaning in the shed doorway, arm folded over his chest, tools lined up proudly behind him. The caption read, "Hard work pays off. Nothing like building your own legacy, tool by tool." The comments flooded with admiration, neighbors gushing about craftsmanship, discipline, dedication. Kelly had replied to one, "All his, years of effort." Hannah's jaw tightened. "She's lying through her teeth." Elaine didn't flinch. She only leaned closer to the screen, studying the picture like evidence in a trial. Then she whispered, so soft it felt like the words belonged to the air itself, "Not anymore." 2 days later, Ruth arrived with her notary seal and steady hands. They spread the receipts, ownership proofs, and Carson's appraisal across the kitchen table. Hannah filmed each stamp as Ruth pressed down, the embossed imprint biting into paper. "There," Ruth said, sitting back with a satisfied sigh. "Every item notarized, yours beyond question. If they scream, they'll be screaming into the wind." Elaine gathered the stack into a folder, sliding it into her briefcase. Her fingers lingered on the clasp before snapping it shut. Her eyes flicked toward the living room ceiling, where muffled laughter drifted from upstairs, Brian and Kelly lounging, oblivious. For a moment, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Elaine spoke quietly, more to herself than to the women beside her. "Let's see how they laugh when the shed is empty." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a deputy in a khaki uniform whose polished boots left faint marks on Elaine's front walk. He tipped his hat politely before sliding the packet into her hands. "Mrs. Foster, all official. You'll want them to sign here." Elaine's fingers didn't tremble as she set the papers on a silver tray, her late husband's, now pressed into new service. She asked the deputy to wait in the living room, then carried the tray down the hall. The scent of coffee and hairspray lingered from upstairs, and she could hear Kelly's voice rising in some phone call. Elaine set the tray on the kitchen counter and called out, "Brian!" "Kelly? Something for you." Brian shuffled in, hair uncombed, phone in one hand. Kelly followed, wrapped in a robe, her face already braced in irritation. When they saw the deputy standing stiffly in the doorway, suspicion flickered across their features. "What is this?" Brian muttered. Elaine slid the tray forward, her tone neutral. "Your notice." Kelly tore open the packet first. Her eyes darted across the bolded lines. "Asset seizure, pending auction." Her voice cracked into a shriek. "She's crazy! Absolutely insane!" The deputy shifted uneasily, but Elaine only folded her hands against her skirt. "Crazy," she repeated, her voice level as a blade, "is selling without warning." Brian grabbed the papers from Kelly, scanning furiously. His face flushed scarlet as he stumbled over the legal phrasing. You can't do this. These are my tools. My shed. Elaine tilted her head, her smile barely visible. Show me your name on a single receipt. Hannah had slipped in from the back porch, phone already recording. The red light blinked steadily as she framed her parents' meltdown. Kelly caught sight of it and lunged forward. Turn that off. But Hannah held her ground. Number. The world should see who you really are. Brian slammed a fist against the counter, rattling the silver tray. The deputy cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Sir, it's a lawful notice. You'll need to comply. Kelly spun toward the window, realizing neighbors had gathered at the edge of the lawn. Mrs. Callahan from next door stood with folded arms, her terrier tucked under one elbow. Two teenagers filmed from the sidewalk, whispering gleefully. Kelly's voice climbed into hysteria. We're being harassed. Everyone's watching. Do you see what she's doing to us? Elaine stepped past her, calm as a preacher. She opened the front door wide, letting the crowd glimpse Kelly's flailing gestures, Brian's crimson face, the official notice trembling in his grip. Yes, Elaine said softly. They see. The deputy collected his signed form, tipped his hat again, and departed. The door closed on Kelly's shrieks, leaving only the sound of Hannah's phone capturing every syllable. That evening, Elaine met Daniel Blake in his downtown office. His suit was immaculate, the blinds drawn against the falling dusk. He read through the deputy's report with slow satisfaction. Well done, he murmured, setting it aside. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. First the shed, next the house. Elaine's eyes flickered, not surprise, but the flicker of someone already considering the next move. She lifted her teacup, steady even now. Behind her, the city hummed, cars rushing through neon-lit streets. Inside the quiet office, however, the air carried the electric promise of escalation. Elaine placed her cup down with a decisive clink. Then let's make sure they never see it coming. The auction house buzzed with the restless energy of men smelling bargains and competition. Fluorescent lights glared off chrome, the air thick with oil and sawdust. Elaine stood near the back of the room with Ruth and Hannah at her sides, her posture straight as a flagpole, her hands clasped over her purse. On the stage, Carson the appraiser spoke into a microphone, voice booming. Lot 14, DeWalt Planer, near mint condition. We'll start the bidding at 300. 350. Someone barked. 4. Another shouted. The numbers leapt higher, men gesturing eagerly, voices overlapping in the charged air. The gavel cracked down. Sold. 500 even. The room erupted in applause and murmurs. Elaine's eyes narrowed, not at the money, but at the principle, each swing of the gavel chipping away at Brian's illusion of ownership. Lot after lot rolled forward. The compressor went for nearly 1,000, the lathe for 750. The table saw in a frenzy of hands shooting up until the gavel slammed at 1,200. By the end of the afternoon, the tally exceeded $10,000. Carson brought the paperwork, his face glowing with satisfaction. Excellent haul, Mrs. Foster. Every cent transferred directly into your account by close of business today. Elaine signed the documents, her pen strokes calm and exact. Hannah squeezed her grandmother's hand. You did it. No, Elaine corrected gently. We did it. By the time they returned home, Brian was pacing in the driveway, his face blotched with rage. The neighbors' blinds tilted, unseen eyes watching. Kelly perched on the porch steps, arms folded tight, her jaw clenched like she'd been grinding it for hours. Brian stormed toward the car the moment Elaine stepped out. You sold my stuff. His voice cracked through the quiet street like a whip. Elaine closed the car door softly, the contrast deliberate. Not yours, she said evenly. Never was. Kelly shot to her feet, fingers stabbing the air. She's incompetent, Brian. That's the only explanation. She doesn't know what she's doing. We'll file for guardianship. We'll take control before she destroys everything. Ruth, still at Elaine's side, let out a sharp laugh. Guardianship? You two couldn't manage a goldfish without running it into debt. Go ahead. Try. Kelly's face darkened. You think this is funny? I think, Ruth replied, her eyes glittering. You're about to learn the difference between thinking you're entitled and proving it in court. Brian's fists clenched. His gaze darted toward Hannah, who stood behind her phone again, recording every word. His mouth opened, a retort forming, but instead, he froze. Because Daniel Blake's black sedan had just pulled up to the curb. The attorney stepped out with a folder under his arm, adjusting his tie as he strode over. He looked not at Brian, not at Kelly, but at Elaine. "I've been reviewing old records," he said, his voice low, meant for her, but audible to the others. "During a refinance attempt in 2014, a signature appeared on a loan application. The bank confirmed today. It wasn't yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Elaine's chin lifted. "Whose was it?" Daniel's gaze flicked just briefly toward Brian. "Your son's." Hannah gasped, nearly dropping her phone. Ruth muttered something under her breath that sounded like a prayer and a curse at once. Brian's color drained as if someone had pulled a plug inside him. That's a mistake." Daniel cut him off smoothly. "It's forgery and fraud. The statute of limitations hasn't expired. The bank is preparing formal action." Kelly whirled on Brian, her shriek raw. "You forged her name? You idiot!" Elaine didn't move. She didn't need to. She simply looked at her son, her boy who once clutched her hand in crowded grocery aisles, who now stood exposed, shaking, under the weight of his own crime. She let the silence stretch, a silence louder than any rebuke. Then, at last, she spoke, her voice cold enough to cut glass. "I told you. It was never yours." The bank's lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and printer ink. Elaine sat upright in a leather chair, Hannah beside her with earbuds dangling, phone recording discreetly. Across the desk, a compliance officer slid a folder forward with clinical precision. "Mrs. Foster, we've reviewed the 2014 refinance application." He turned the page, revealing the scrawled signature at the bottom. "Our handwriting experts compared this to your verified signatures on file. This one is fraudulent." Elaine studied the page without flinching. The swooping E wasn't hers. It was Brian's clumsy mimicry. For years she had shouldered the ache of suspicion, the vague unease when strange letters arrived in the mail. Now, the doubt was gone. Only certainty remained. Daniel Blake, seated at her other side, tapped his pen lightly against his legal pad. "So the bank is prepared to proceed?" The officer nodded. "We'll submit our findings to the authorities and cooperate fully. The fraud complaint will be filed this week." Daniel closed the folder with a crisp snap. "Good. I'll file on behalf of Mrs. Foster concurrently. 2 tracks of action, both pointing the same direction." Elaine folded her hands, her nails pressing into her palms until crescents marked her skin. "And that direction is toward accountability." When she returned home that evening, Kelly's voice was the first thing she heard, shrieking, raw, spilling through the open kitchen window. Elaine paused on the walk, Ruth catching up beside her. Inside, Kelly paced like a caged animal, phone clutched to her ear. "Do you understand what you've done? Fraud, Brian. Prison time fraud. You think this is some little mistake? They're going to crucify us." Brian slumped at the table, head in his hands. "Us? I was trying to save this place. For both of us." Kelly slammed the phone down. "Don't drag me into your stupidity. You forged her name. You think anyone's going to believe I didn't know?" Ruth pushed open the back door without knocking. Elaine followed, calm as ever, her gaze sweeping over the scene. Kelly spun, pointing at Brian. "He dragged me into this. Don't you look at me, Elaine. I didn't sign a damn thing." Elaine's voice was measured, but it landed with the force of a hammer. "Your partners in greed. Always have been. One forged, the other encouraged. Don't pretend your hands are clean." Kelly's mouth opened, but no sound came. From the corner, Hannah whispered fiercely, "Grandma, you're winning." The words slipped past the tension like a spark on dry grass. Elaine met her granddaughter's eyes and saw not just loyalty but pride, something deeper. A torch passed across generations. Brian pushed to his feet suddenly, fists trembling. "You think you've beaten us? This is our house. We've lived here for years." Daniel's voice cut through the room before Elaine needed to answer. He'd followed them inside, his briefcase already open. "Correction. You've squatted here under her roof, and now you'll answer to the law. Judge Daniels has accepted my filing and scheduled a fraud trial." The silence that followed was thunderous. Even Kelly stopped pacing, her robe belt dangling loose. "When?" Elaine asked. 2 weeks, Daniel replied. "Expedited, given the circumstances. He doesn't tolerate delays." Kelly paled, sinking into a chair. Brian muttered something incoherent, eyes darting toward the window where neighbors lingered, listening. Elaine straightened, her voice steady enough to cut through the thick air. 2 weeks, then. 2 weeks until you stand exposed in front of everyone, until the lies you built crumble where the whole city can see. Her words hung in the air, final and cold. The kitchen clock ticked once, twice, before resuming its steady rhythm, marking the countdown to judgment. The courtroom was cold, all polished wood and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Elaine sat at the petitioner's table beside Daniel Blake, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. Across the aisle, Brian and Kelly huddled with their attorney, a young man who looked too green to be defending decades of greed. The bailiff called the case. Judge Daniels entered, robes flowing, expression carved from stone. His gaze swept the room before landing on Elaine, then flicking to Brian with clear distaste. Petitioners allege, he began, voice deep and resonant, that Mrs. Elaine Foster is incompetent to manage her affairs. They seek guardianship over her person and estate. He glanced down at the file. Mrs. Foster's estate being, I note, considerable. Brian rose immediately, fists clenching at his sides. Your Honor, she's not capable anymore. She forgets things. She makes rash decisions. She sold valuable property without consulting us. She's destroying our family legacy. Elaine kept her eyes forward, calm as stone. Daniel simply adjusted his tie and stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Foster has no history of cognitive decline. In fact, she agreed to undergo a full exam by an independent specialist last week. May I submit the results? The judge nodded. Daniel handed the file to the clerk. The room waited as Judge Daniels scanned the pages. Then, with a faint snort, he looked over the rim of his glasses at Brian. Your mother scored perfectly across all categories. Attention, memory, reasoning, higher than average for her age. A ripple of laughter passed through the gallery. Kelly shifted in her seat, her cheeks blotching red. Brian sputtered, but she doesn't. Sit down, Mr. Foster. The judge's voice cut like a whip. Daniel didn't press the advantage yet. He only inclined his head. We have one more item, Your Honor. He gestured toward Hannah, who stood nervously from the front bench, clutching a small recorder. Her hands shook, but her voice carried. I live in the house with them. I've heard what they say to her. She pressed play. Brian's mocking tone filled the solemn chamber. Yeah, the shed. Perfect little retirement suite for the old bat. Kelly's laugh followed. Dirt floors are good for the joints, builds character. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Hannah hit pause, blinking back tears. That's how they treat her. That's why they want control. Not because she's incompetent, but because she isn't. Judge Daniels leaned back in his chair, disgust plain across his face. He fixed Brian and Kelly with a stare sharp enough to cut marrow. I have heard enough. His gavel struck once, echoing off the walls. Petition denied. Mrs. Foster is fully competent. Guardianship is unwarranted. Furthermore, I caution the petitioners that misuse of this court for personal gain will not be tolerated. Consider yourselves warned. Brian opened his mouth to argue, but Kelly yanked his sleeve, hissing, Shut up! The young lawyer looked as if he wished he could melt into the floor. Elaine rose gracefully, Daniel gathering her papers. She didn't look at her son or his wife as she walked past. Silence followed her like a cloak of dignity, broken only by Ruth's soft chuckle from the gallery bench. Every swing they take, Ruth murmured as she joined Elaine in the hallway, cuts their own rope. Elaine didn't reply. She didn't need to. She simply adjusted her coat, eyes forward, already stepping into the next battle that awaited. The ink on Judge Daniels' ruling had barely dried before Elaine set her next move in motion. 2 days later, she sat in a sleek conference room downtown, the city skyline glinting beyond the tall windows. A heavy leather folder lay open before her, contracts neatly stacked inside. Across the table sat an investor in his 40s, sharp suit, calm smile, eyes already picturing profit. His name was Victor Lane, a developer with a reputation for turning tired homes into glossy showpieces. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Foster, Victor said, flipping through the appraisal. This house is solid, but it's dated. My team would gut it. New roof, new kitchen, open floor plan. Once it's remodeled, the value will triple. That's why I'm offering cash. Immediate closing. Elaine listened without flinching. She had lived in that house for 40 years, every wall etched with memory. But memories could not be collateral. Memories could not shield her from her son's greed. She uncapped her pen. "Then let's begin," she said. The signing took only minutes. With each signature, Elaine felt the grip of Brian's entitlement loosen, one claw at a time. The final stroke of her pen was clean, decisive, and final. Victor closed the folder, slid it across the table. "Congratulations. You've just made the smartest move of your life." Elaine allowed herself the faintest smile. Number, just the most necessary. That evening, back at the house, the first tremor of the storm broke. Brian had wandered into the kitchen just as Elaine's voicemail clicked on the answering machine, her voice reading out the automated confirmation. "This is to verify your scheduled closing with Lane Investments. Please call with any questions." The message played in full before Brian realized what he was hearing. His body went rigid, his face blanching before it flushed an angry red. "What? What the hell was that?" he bellowed. Elaine, pouring tea, didn't even look up. "Business." Brian lunged forward, stabbing a finger at the machine. "You sold the house? Our house? Without telling us?" Elaine turned then, calm as stone. "My house. And yes." Kelly staggered in from the living room, her mascara already smeared from crying before she even reached the doorway. You can't do this. Where are we supposed to go? How will this look?" Her voice cracked, the sobbing half real, half performative. She pressed her palms to her face. "She's ruining us." Elaine sipped her tea. "Number you did that." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Brian's fists curled at his sides, shoulders shaking with impotent rage. Kelly collapsed against the counter, wailing as though her grief alone could halt legal documents. From the hallway, Hannah leaned silently against the doorframe, phone tucked in her pocket for once. She didn't need to record this. The scene would etch itself in her memory forever. A quiet smile ghosted across her lips, not cruel, but resolute. Justice was unfolding before her eyes, slow and relentless. Elaine set her teacup down, its porcelain clink echoing like a gavel. "You thought you could bury me in a shed. Instead, you'll watch me walk out the front door while the floor is ripped from under you." Brian lunged a step closer but stopped. Something in her eyes froze him, something unmovable, untouchable. Kelly's sobs filled the silence, the house itself seeming to sag under the weight of endings. Upstairs, the floor creaked, the old bones of the home groaning like they knew their time was nearly up. Elaine rose from the table, collected her folder, and walked past her son without brushing his sleeve. Hannah followed, her quiet smile never fading. The house that had once been fortress and prison was now a weapon, and it was already pointed at Brian and Kelly. The conference room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and new paper. Elaine sat at the long, polished table, Victor Lane opposite her, and a closing agent sliding documents across the surface one by one. "Sign here, and initial here," the agent instructed. Elaine's hand never trembled. Each stroke of her pen severed another tie, each set of initials a blade cutting through decades of entitlement. When she capped her pen at last, the agent smiled. "Congratulations, Mrs. Foster. The sale is complete. Wire transfer should hit your account by this afternoon." Elaine only nodded. To her, congratulations meant little. What mattered was the confirmation email pinging on Hannah's phone minutes later. A deposit of more than $500,000, hers alone. Hannah squeezed her hand under the table, whispering, "You did it." "No," Elaine said quietly, her eyes narrowing with the weight of the moment. "I'm just getting started." Back at the house, the notice of eviction came not by phone, but by uniform. A sheriff's deputy, the same one who'd served the seizure papers weeks earlier, stood on the porch with an official order in hand. "Mrs. Foster," he said respectfully, "the eviction is scheduled for 30 days from today. On that date, the premises will be vacated by force if necessary." Brian lunged from behind Kelly, grabbing the paper. His face turned blotchy as he read. "You can't kick us out. This is our home." The deputy didn't flinch. "Court order. Signed by Judge Daniels. You'll want to make other arrangements." Kelly's voice cracked into a shriek. "You can't do this. You're throwing us in the street." Elaine's tone was calm, almost pitying. "Number you did that." The day of the lockout hearing, Brian stormed into Judge Daniels' courtroom with a folder of hastily printed papers. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. Kelly trailed behind, face pale but defiant. "Your Honor," Brian barked, This eviction order is unfair. We've lived in that house for years. She can't just throw us out. Judge Daniels peered over his glasses. Mr. Foster, the house is solely your mother's legal property. She has every right to sell it. The eviction stands. Brian's face burned crimson. He slammed his fist on the table. This isn't justice, it's theft. The gavel cracked down. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. Elaine leaned forward just enough for only those near her to hear. The shed was just the start. Hannah, seated beside her, whispered reverently, "This is history." But history had one more twist to write that afternoon. As the court adjourned, uniformed officers approached the back row where Kelly sat. "Mrs. Kelly Foster?" one asked. She blinked, startled. "Yes? You're under arrest for submitting fraudulent income documentation in a 2014 loan application. Stand up, please." The color drained from her face. "No, no. This is a mistake. Brian did that, not me." But the officers were already reading her rights, slipping cold steel cuffs around her wrists. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Hannah's phone trembled in her hands as she recorded, eyes wide. Brian surged forward, shouting, "You can't take her! She didn't do anything!" Judge Daniels rapped his gavel again, stern and unimpressed. "Sit down, Mr. Foster. The evidence speaks for itself." Kelly twisted toward Elaine as she was led away, mascara streaking down her cheeks. You planned this." Elaine met her gaze without blinking. "Number you did." The doors swung shut behind Kelly, her sobs echoing down the corridor. Brian collapsed into his chair, his fight gone hollow. Elaine rose slowly, collected her bag, and walked past him without a word. Hannah followed, her phone still recording, her smile quiet but unshakable. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, carrying the sound of traffic and distant siren. Ruth waited by the curb, her arms folded, her grin sly. "You're dismantling them piece by piece," she said. Elaine paused, adjusting the strap of her purse. "Not dismantling, revealing." Her eyes hardened, the weight of unfinished business pressing forward. The war wasn't over. Not yet. The police cruiser rolled up the street just after sunrise, its lights off, its engine low. The quiet hum was enough to draw curtains twitching in half the houses on the block. Elaine stood at her front window with a mug of coffee, calm as a priest before a sermon. On the porch next door, Mrs. Callahan clutched her terrier, whispering to her husband. Across the street, two teenagers leaned on their bikes, phones already out. By the time the cruiser parked in front of Elaine's house, a small crowd had gathered as though the neighborhood itself had been waiting for this morning. Brian stumbled out onto the porch in sweatpants, his face gray from sleepless nights. When the two officers approached, his voice cracked. "She's already in jail. Why are you here?" The taller officer didn't flinch. "Court-ordered retrieval of personal items and transfer to county holding. Mrs. Kelly Foster is to be remanded into custody until trial." The words hit like stones. Kelly appeared in the doorway, wrists still raw from cuffs the night before, hair matted, mascara ghosting beneath her eyes. She looked less like the polished woman who'd hosted barbecues, and more like someone caught in the act of fleeing a crime. "Please," she begged, voice hoarse, "can't we do this privately?" Everyone's watching, but privacy was long gone. The block had filled with whispers, cameras, murmurs that would travel faster than any news outlet. Hannah leaned casually against the porch rail, her phone angled steady, capturing every moment. No smirk, no cruelty, just the silent witness of someone determined to remember. Brian's voice rose, desperate. "This is humiliation. You don't know what you're doing. This is my wife." The shorter officer clipped cuffs around Kelly's wrists again. The metallic click echoed across the lawn. She whimpered, sagging against the officer's grip. From the sidewalk, a neighbor muttered, "Fraud. Can you believe it?" Another whispered, "After the way she treated Elaine? Figures." Brian spun, wild-eyed. "Shut up. None of you know her." But the more he raged, the quieter the crowd grew, until even his voice sounded small against the weight of his wife's disgrace. Then Elaine stepped out. She didn't say a word, didn't raise her chin or her voice. She simply walked past Brian, her heels steady on the porch steps, the morning light glinting against her silver hair. Her silence was more cutting than any argument. Kelly's gaze locked onto her, pleading, "Elaine, please, you can stop this. You know I don't belong." But Elaine kept walking, the the steam of her coffee rising in the cool air, her calm presence unmoved by Kelly's collapse. Behind her, Ruth emerged with a small, knowing smile, leaning toward Hannah as Kelly was guided into the cruiser. "Prison meals don't need dining room," she whispered. Hannah's shoulders shook with quiet laughter as her camera stayed fixed. The cruiser door slammed shut, muffling Kelly's sobs. The engine rumbled to life. As it pulled away, the crowd shifted, murmurs swelling, the story already sprouting wings that would carry it through the entire suburb. Brian stood rooted in the yard, hands limp at his sides, his reputation unraveling thread by thread. His neighbor's eyes no longer held pity, only judgment, sharp and unrelenting. Elaine walked past him without pause, Ruth and Hannah flanking her. She didn't look back, didn't need to. Behind her, the house was no longer theirs. Ahead, the reckoning was still unfolding. The morning of the lockout broke bright and sharp, the kind of blue sky day that made even small events feel monumental. But what unfolded on Elaine's lawn was no small thing. Two sheriff's cruisers idled at the curb, lights off, presence undeniable. Deputies in tan uniforms strode up the walkway, clipboards in hand, their boots striking the pavement with heavy finality. Neighbors gathered in clusters at the edges of their driveways, coffee cups and cell phones in hand. Elaine stood at her garden gate with Ruth and Hannah beside her. She didn't step forward. She didn't need to. This was the state's work now. Brian burst onto the porch the moment the deputies climbed the steps, his face streaked with sweat, his hair sticking in wild tufts. "You can't do this. You can't throw me out of my own house." One deputy unfolded the order, voice steady, official. "Mr. Foster, this property has been sold. You are no longer the legal occupant. You are required to vacate immediately." Brian grabbed the railing with white knuckles. "No, this is theft. I'll—" The second deputy moved past him, stepping inside. Moments later, two more deputies appeared, carrying a sofa through the front door. Its legs scraped the siding as they dumped it unceremoniously on the lawn. Gasps rippled through the crowd, phones tilted higher, recording. "Stop!" Brian lunged, grabbing at the sofa, but the deputy only brushed him aside. Another chair followed, then boxes, then clothing still on hangers. One by one, his life was stripped from the house and laid bare on the grass like discarded refuse. From across the street, a man muttered, "About time." Brian's face twisted as he spun toward the crowd. "You think this is funny? Watching me lose everything?" His voice broke, wild and ragged. "None of you understand." But the laughter was real now. Low, cruel, inevitable. Elaine finally stepped forward. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the porch. Brian froze when he saw her, his chest heaving, sweat dripping into his eyes. Elaine's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Now you know the floor." The words struck harder than any gavel. Brian staggered back, collapsing onto the steps as if her sentence alone had taken the air from his lungs. Behind her, Hannah lifted her phone, framing her father's broken figure against the backdrop of furniture scattered like wreckage. She whispered, almost reverent, "Justice looks like this." Ruth crossed her arms, a smirk tugging at her mouth. Never seen a yard sale this honest. The deputies carried out the last of it. A cracked dresser, a box of chipped dishes, the sagging mattress. Then they locked the front door, slid the key into an envelope, and handed it to Elaine. Brian lunged forward again, but this time two deputies intercepted him, gripping his arms with firm restraint. He shouted, incoherent rage spilling out, but the crowd only raised their phones higher. Elaine turned without looking at him, the envelope tucked neatly into her purse. As she walked back to the gate, Ruth and Hannah flanking her, the sound of Brian's screams filled the street, desperate, hollow, stripped of power. But for Elaine, each cry was only confirmation. The house was hers no longer, but the victory was. And yet, in the pit of her stomach, she knew. Broken men did not vanish quietly. The street had finally gone quiet after the chaos of the eviction. The deputies had left with the same efficient rhythm with which they had arrived, and the curious neighbors, satisfied with the spectacle, had drifted back into their homes. Only traces of their presence remained, the faint smell of cigarette smoke on the breeze, the low murmur of gossip still echoing faintly from porches, and the unmistakable feeling that everyone would be talking about this day for weeks to come. What lingered most, though, was Brian. He sat slumped on the curb just beyond the pile of furniture that had been dumped carelessly on the lawn. His head hung low, his shoulders sagged forward as though the bones of his spine could no longer bear the weight of his failures. His breath came in ragged gasps, and when his hands slid down to his knees, they shook so badly it was as if even his body rejected the reality of what had just unfolded. Elaine remained by the gate, standing tall with her purse balanced neatly at her side. Her face was a study in stillness. Hannah hovered beside her, the phone still clutched in her hand, though she had stopped recording. Even Ruth, so quick with her sharp quips and mocking asides, was uncharacteristically silent. They could all feel the moment stretching, heavy with a grief that looked less like loss and more like punishment. At last, Brian pushed himself shakily to his feet. His steps were uneven as he staggered across the patch of grass, shoes sinking into dirt where the lawn had long since worn thin. When he reached the spot in front of his mother, his knees buckled again, and this time he did not fight the fall. He dropped down before her, the gesture clumsy, desperate, and unpracticed. His palms pressed together as though in prayer, dirt grinding into the skin. "Mom," he rasped, his voice hoarse and raw from shouting earlier. "Please, please don't do this to me. Don't walk away from me. I'm your son. Your only son." His words tumbled out in uneven bursts, as though he had no control over them. His eyes, bloodshot and ringed with exhaustion, lifted to hers in a silent plea. Elaine did not answer. She did not lower herself to meet his gaze, nor did she reach for his trembling hands. Instead, she studied him the way one studies something distant and unrecognizable, as though she could not quite reconcile this groveling man with the child she had once carried in her arms. Hannah shifted beside her, her voice low but firm. "Don't forgive him, Grandma. He doesn't deserve it. Not after everything." Her tone was not cruel, but resolute, as if she feared even a flicker of her grandmother's compassion might undo all that had been fought for. The words cut through the silence, and for a long moment Elaine remained perfectly still. Her son was still on his knees in the dirt, his chest heaving as tears ran unchecked down his face. At last she spoke, her tone soft yet unyielding. "Forgiveness is free. Trust isn't." Brian flinched at the words, his lips trembling as though he might argue, but nothing came. His throat clicked as he swallowed hard, a man who finally understood that some doors, once shut, would never be opened again. Elaine turned then, her heels pressing softly against the gravel as she began to walk away. Ruth followed close behind, her face etched with quiet satisfaction, but tempered with gravity. Hannah lingered for a heartbeat longer, her eyes locked on her father's broken figure. She did not smile this time, nor did she lift her phone to record. Instead, she simply committed the image to memory, a man brought to his knees, not by strangers, not by enemies, but by the weight of his own choices. By the time Hannah caught up with her grandmother at the end of the block, Brian was still kneeling in the dirt, his sobs muffled against the empty air, his hands clutching the earth as if he could anchor himself against the tide that had already swept him away. Elaine did not look back. She didn't need to. His cries followed them down the street, raw and broken, echoing in the space between what he wanted and what could never again be his. And yet, in the recesses of her mind, Elaine felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. A man with nothing left to lose was not finished. He was only becoming dangerous. The law office was quiet that afternoon, its heavy oak doors muffling the sounds of traffic from the street outside. Inside, sunlight streamed across Daniel Blake's conference table, illuminating the neat stack of legal folders set before Elaine. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh ink, a scent that carried the weight of permanence. Elaine sat straight-backed, her purse resting at her feet, her expression composed but grave. Across from her, Daniel adjusted his glasses and tapped the folder with the edge of his. "This is the new draft of your will, Mrs. Foster. Once signed and notarized, it will override the previous version entirely. No ambiguities, no loopholes." Hannah sat beside her grandmother, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breath caught somewhere between anticipation and disbelief. Ruth leaned comfortably in the chair on the other side, her notary seal waiting in her bag. Daniel slid the first page forward. "As discussed, Brian and Kelly are excluded entirely. No inheritance, no rights of contest. Their names do not appear in this document at all. Everything, your accounts, personal property, and remaining assets, transfers to your granddaughter. He paused, his eyes shifting toward Hannah. You are the sole heir. Hannah blinked, her lips parting in shock. She turned to Elaine, her voice barely above a whisper. Grandma, are you sure? Elaine's gaze was steady. You stood by me when they tried to bury me. Loyalty deserves protection. Their cruelty deserves silence. Daniel nodded approvingly. To further safeguard against any challenge, we're establishing an irrevocable trust. Once signed, no court can alter its terms. They can file petitions, shout in courtrooms, hire lawyers until their pockets are empty. It won't matter. The inheritance is sealed. He slid another stack of papers forward. Initial here and here. Elaine picked up the pen. Her hand was steady, each stroke deliberate. With every signature, she was not only cutting away her son and his wife, but binding her legacy to the granddaughter who had become her true ally. Ruth leaned forward, pulling her seal and stamp from her bag. The heavy click of the notary seal pressing into paper echoed like a final verdict. She glanced at Elaine with a wry smile. Every document, locked and witnessed. If they come clawing, they'll get nothing but paper cuts. Elaine allowed herself a rare flicker of a smile. They get nothing but silence. The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Daniel gathered the documents into their folder with practiced precision. There's one more matter, he said, opening a separate file. The proceeds from the tool auction. You asked me to prepare the transfer. Hannah tilted her head, surprised. Transfer? To where? Elaine met her granddaughter's questioning gaze with quiet resolve. Those tools built this neighborhood, fixed porches, mended fences, repaired what others neglected. They mocked me with that shed, tried to make me small inside it. Now it becomes something greater. Daniel slid the file across the table. The Elaine Foster Community Tool Library. Nonprofit status approved. The auction proceeds have already been donated. The library will carry your name permanently, a resource for families who can't afford equipment. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling. You gave it all away? Elaine reached for her granddaughter's hand, clasping it firmly. What I gave away was a weapon turned against me. What I built is a legacy. They left me with shame. I leave the town with tools. Let Brian and Kelly live with that contrast. Ruth leaned back in her chair, grinning. From shed to shrine. That'll sting worse than any eviction notice. Elaine rose from her seat, the folder tucked beneath her arm. She felt lighter somehow, as though every signature had carved away not just her son's greed, but the years of silence she had endured under his roof. For the first time in a long while, her future felt uncluttered, sharp, and entirely her own. Outside the office, the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the pavement. Elaine paused at the curb, Hannah on one side and Ruth on the other. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply, her voice barely more than a whisper. It's done. They can howl. They can rage. But my name will not be theirs to stain. The three women walked toward the waiting car, their heels clicking in unison, each step carrying them further into a future where Elaine's silence had become louder than her son's screams. And though Elaine's expression was calm, she knew this victory was not the end of the storm. When stripped of family, money, and pride, a man like Brian would not vanish quietly. The worst, she suspected, was still to come. Ibn stretched taut across the entrance of the small brick building, its freshly painted facade glowing under the autumn sun. The old structure had once been a vacant storage facility, forgotten and neglected at the edge of town. Now, after weeks of quiet work, it bore a new sign above its doors in bold blue lettering, the Elaine Foster Community Tool Library. Reporters milled about, cameras flashing, microphones poised to capture every word. A cluster of townspeople, neighbors, tradesmen, young couples stood shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalk, murmuring with curiosity and admiration. The mayor had even come, a cheerful man with a broad tie who looked eager to attach himself to this story of generosity and resilience. Elaine stood at the center of it all, a pair of oversized scissors in her hand, Hannah at her side. Her granddaughter's eyes shimmered with pride, her smile bright enough to match the October sky. Ruth was there too, stationed just behind them, her arms folded and her grin sharp as ever. The mayor gestured toward Elaine as cameras zoomed in. Today we honor a woman who took something that once represented cruelty and mockery and turned it into a gift for this entire community. Mrs. Foster, your tool library will serve generations. On behalf of the city, thank you. Applause rose from the crowd, warm and sustained. Elaine inclined her head in acknowledgement, her lips curving into the faint smile of someone who did not crave praise but accepted it with dignity. Hannah squeezed her arm, whispering, "You did it, Grandma. Everyone can finally see you the way I do." Elaine lifted the scissors and cut through the ribbon. The crowd erupted again, the cameras flashing like fireworks. When the doors swung open, rows of gleaming shelves and neatly organized tools were revealed. Drills, saws, wrenches, gardening equipment, all donated, cataloged, and made accessible for anyone who needed them. The building smelled of fresh paint and oiled wood, the air charged with possibility. Inside, children ran their fingers along the handles of tools they had only ever seen in their father's garages. A young couple signed up for membership at the desk, chatting excitedly about fixing their first home. An older man studied a power saw with reverence, muttering, "Could never have afforded this myself." Every voice, every smile, every grateful glance turned toward Elaine, who moved quietly through the room, receiving handshakes and thanks. Her shoulders straightened with each exchange, a lifetime of quiet endurance finally acknowledged in the light of day. But not all faces in the crowd were admiring. Toward the back of the sidewalk, Brian lingered with his hands stuffed deep into his pocket. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unwashed, his face a portrait of bitterness. A few neighbors noticed him, nudging one another, whispering behind their hands. "That's her son," one muttered. "The one who tried to take everything," another replied. Brian's jaw tightened as he caught the looks. He turned away, his humiliation as visible as the rust-stained sneakers on his feet. Each cheer for Elaine cut into him like a blade, every camera flash burning another mark into his pride. He left before the news crews could catch him, his shadow shrinking as he disappeared down the street. As for Kelly, her absence spoke louder than her presence ever could. Still awaiting trial, still facing. The charges she had once insisted belonged to Brian alone. Her name had become a hiss in town gossip. No invitations, no sympathetic neighbors, only whispers about prison time and a fall from grace. Back inside the tool library, Ruth leaned against a shelf, her gaze sweeping over the busy crowd. She caught Elaine's eye and smirked. "Well," she said, her voice just loud enough for Hannah to hear, "you turned their insults into monument. They tried to chain you to that shed, and now your name is bolted above the door for all to see." Elaine's eyes softened as she glanced at Hannah, whose smile hadn't dimmed all afternoon. For the first time in years, the girl looked unburdened, free of the shadows her parents had cast. Elaine inhaled slowly, letting the sounds of gratitude and laughter wash over her. Yet, even in triumph, a chill threaded its way through her chest. She had rewritten her legacy, secured Hannah's future, and silenced her tormentors with dignity. But she knew the story was not finished. A cornered man, stripped of everything, remained out there, wounded, humiliated, and capable of anything. Elaine laid a hand on Hannah's shoulder and whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "The hardest part is yet to come." Elaine's new condo was not large, but it was hers, and it was quiet. The space smelled faintly of lemon oil from the polished dining table and the rosemary she had clipped fresh from the small balcony planter. The walls were freshly painted a warm cream, sunlight softened by gauzy curtains, and in the corner of the room, a framed deed hung in a simple oak frame, a declaration of independence that needed no embellishment. Tonight was her first dinner in this new space, and it carried a sense of ceremony. Ruth arrived first, setting down a basket of bread with a wry flourish. "Don't get used to this. Next time you're cooking for me?" She winked, her laughter rising easily as she embraced her friend. Hannah came next, carrying a bottle of sparkling cider, her steps light, her smile unburdened. The table was set with care, white plates, polished silver, and a trio of candles flickering gently. their flames dancing against the soft evening shadows. A pot roast sat in the center, its aroma filling the room with the comfort of home. It was not extravagant, but it was hearty, a meal born of Elaine's steady hands and Ruth's teasing advice. As they ate, the conversation flowed without hesitation. There was laughter, real laughter, not the brittle kind Elaine had endured for years under her son's roof. Ruth told a story about a disastrous notary appointment with a man who tried to pay her in coupons. Hannah shared a moment from class, imitating her professor's booming voice until all three women nearly choked from laughing. Elaine herself told stories from the old school office, recalling the principal who had once locked himself out of his own building and tried to climb through a window. The air was light, but beneath it ran a current of something deeper. Safety. For the first time in years, Elaine was not enduring dinner, she was savoring it. After dessert, Ruth's bread pudding still steaming from the oven, Hannah leaned back in her chair, her eyes shining in the candlelight. She looked at her grandmother, her voice trembling with emotion. "You gave me more than inheritance, Grandma. You gave me courage, to stand up, to never let people tell me what I'm worth." Elaine reached across the table, her hand resting over Hannah's, her expression softened, her eyes wet but steady. "Respect isn't given, it's built. You watched me build mine, brick by brick, even when they tried to tear it down." The room fell quiet for a moment, but it was not a silence of tension. It was reverent, like the pause after a hymn, each of them feeling the weight of what had been said. Ruth raised her glass of cider. "To building, then. May it outlast every insult, every lie, every thief who thinks they can steal what isn't theirs." They clinked glasses, the sound crisp and bright in the small room. Later, as the night deepened, Hannah helped clear the dishes while Ruth dried them, the easy rhythm of family replacing the chaos of what had come before. Elaine lingered near the window, her gaze drifting over the city lights below. For the first time, the glow of windows in other buildings did not feel like judgment or intrusion. They felt like company, like proof that life continued, and she was part of it on her own terms. When the table was cleared and the candles had burned low, Elaine settled into her chair with a contented sigh. The framed deed on the wall caught the last of the flickering light, its lettering glowing faintly as if alive. She closed her eyes for a moment, her lips curving into a peaceful smile, her body relaxed, shoulders sinking into the cushions, as Ruth and Hannah chatted softly in the kitchen. The warmth of their voices drifted to her like a lullaby. Elaine let her hand rest against the arm of the chair, her breathing even, her heart steady. At last, she felt what had eluded her for so long, peace that was earned, not borrowed, and safety that no one could take away. The candles flickered once more, shadows stretching across the walls before the room settled into stillness, and in that silence, her story closed with the truth she had carried to the end. "They laughed that I belonged in a shed. I sold the shed, the tools, and the roof, and left them with nothing but shame."